All right, greetings everybody. Old guy jamming here. We're going to take this JJ apart today and put a different tube in the valve slot one or valve socket one. Wanted you to see the settings as they'll stay throughout the test today. Presence at noon, master right there at 9 o'clock, treble straight up, middle 9 o'clock, bass 3 o'clock, the gain, I turned that up after for a test, but the gain is right up there at noon or 5.5, which is funny because, like in another famous example, this amp goes to 11. So it's just that much louder than all those other amps that go to 10. All right, and that's where the settings will stay. So we'll show you the tube roll. We'll go inside first, and then you'll hear, the first clip you hear is stock, and we'll go through both the non-brown eye mode and then the signature brown eye mode. And then the second clip you see will be after we did a tube roll, and then we'll repeat those two but shorter so you don't see the brown eye setting. It'll just be the JJ Friedman sound not switched over to the brown eye setting. And we'll repeat those things again. So the first one you'll see will be stock, and the second one will be after the tube roll. Alrighty. Good morning. Here we are. I got the JJ Junior on the bench with other necessary things. You can change tubes in this pretty easily by taking the 4 screws off here. This back plate comes off, and there's room enough in there for you to change tubes, which is pretty cool. That's awfully nice. But we're gonna, I figured, why not just take it apart and take a look inside. So we'll take this off, and then these 4 screws here. Pull the chassis out, set it back on top of the inverted housing, or pull the guts out, I guess, and put it back on the inverted chassis. I've let it sat for a while, and I left it plugged in. I unplugged it from the power source, but left the speaker plugged in, and I activated the on-off switch several times, which kind of makes sense to me. Dr. Z said that was a nice way to discharge an amplifier. I still advise a lot of caution unless your amp's been sitting for a few days, but that makes sense to me that you could discharge by toggling the on-off switch with a load on it. You got to be able to dissipate a bit of charge in the large capacitors, I would think. Anyway, I'll be back when we get this thing out. All right, we're back, and I went ahead and threw a meter on this and checked the voltage on all the caps, and it didn't get anything greater than 11 millivolts, so the thing's effectively dead. So it doesn't mean I can't not be careful. I still want to be respectful of those electrons, but it's a good tip. Unplug it from the power source, keep it plugged into your load, and then activate the on-off switch, standby switch, and should help discharge everything. But always respect. All right, this is assembled in America, down in Los Angeles. So an American-made amp, which is pretty cool. If you're hot to buy something American, go get yourself a Friedman amplifier. Now, everything in here is pretty standard, looks like, to me. We've got, let me get a pointer. Do I have a pointer? Do I need a pointer? Maybe I don't even need a pointer. But we've got slow blow input fuses right here. Okay, power section comes in, power transformer in here. Now here's a nice big solid state rectifier right there. And before you poo-poo the solid state rectifier, Dr. Z, which has a channel that's fairly new, I think. I subscribed a little while ago. Lots of good stuff. He says that solid state rectification is a heck of a lot tighter than a tube rectifier. Tube rectifiers don't act as fast, and you end up with a spongier sounding amp. So if you want an amp that's got some tightness to it, that's what you want. And instead of using 4 separate diodes, they just went with a nice PCB mount full wave rectifier right there, full bridge rectifier, which is pretty cool. All right, so nice. Now, old guy McKenzie did a review of this amp, which I thought was pretty confusing because in the title he says, worst amp I ever bought, I think. That's the title. And then, but yet then he has a hard time getting to anything he doesn't like. He keeps remarking about how cool the features are inside. So I thought it was kind of confusing. One thing he did talk about was the glue holding some of these switches in. The front switch for on-off, he said, now that's really tacky to glue it in. Well, it's not being glued in. The switch has 2 tabs on the top and bottom. It's a friction fit switch. There's a rectangular hole cut in the chassis here, and then the switch is trimmed out, and it's got 2 wings on it, and when you push it in, it snaps. But without a screw holding it in, it could end up being a little bit loose if your tolerances aren't just right. So they just put the glue on there to prevent the thing from ever starting to vibrate or rattle, but it's as stuck in there as anything. So maybe McKenzie just didn't understand how those switches work. Not a problem with me. All right, large value capacitors for our filtration. Also, McKenzie talked about these sandstone resistors as being inadequate. There is nothing wrong with those things. They are industry standard. They are great. They're meant to be mounted on PCB boards. This guy back here is a higher duty one, and it has its own heatsink on it. It's encased in aluminum, and underneath that would be some thermal goo, stuff we used to play with, which was just tons of fun because once you got it on you, it ended up everywhere, but you could never tell where it came from. The guy I worked with would often put some right under the handle of my coffee cup, and minutes later, it's everywhere, and and everybody has a good laugh over it. Anyway, this is a power resistor as well, encased in an aluminum heatsink, and it's mounted to the chassis. So it's not that they spent less here because they didn't put those on. Those aren't meant to be here, and these aren't meant to be there. Now, I think you can run this amp without a load. You can run it just with the DI, and no load connected is the reason I think that big resistor is there. Speaker outputs are right there. That sucker's there. Don't hold me to it, but I don't think you have to run this amp with a speaker connected. I think you can run it with just the DI out. Anyway, circuit board looks great. Traces are on the back side, so can't see them, but they are thicker than some I've seen. Not as thick as you would get in the JCA over there. Not as thick as Ignator, but certainly thicker than the Marshall boards and some of the other boards where the traces are really, really thin. You'd have a hard time repairing a trace on some of them. Okay, the EL84s are there, the 2 output tubes. I haven't seen a bias pot. The input is here, V1. We're going to swap that out today with a lower gain tube just to see if we can prevent the amp from getting to that compression level. An amp starts to compress when you've maximized the gain. When the gain runs into the top of the limit, it starts to compress, and we're going to see if we can reduce the first input stage there and maybe allow the amp to be a little less compressed. I mean, it sounds great as is, but the Marshalls aren't quite as tight. I'd like to have a little more room before we hit that ceiling. Anyway, so valve 1, valve 2, and then valve 3. Board's nicely laid out. Really nice. It's well labeled. Like up here, we've got rear panel foot switch jack. Over here, this area that is surrounded by the little dashed line, that represents the effects loop. There's the send, I believe, and there's the return jack, and there's the board. If you ever have a problem, and this is a neat thing too, if you ever have a problem, you can disconnect the board that's faulty and just buy another one from Friedman down in Los Angeles and plug it in without having to remove the whole stinking board. I was going to say motherboard, but it's not really a motherboard. This is the direct out stuff, again, plugged in. So if you have an issue with that, you can just put a new card in. And, that's about it. Again, don't see a bias pot, but another neat feature here is that these pots are all large metal pots, which is nice, and you could wash them out very easily. They have big windows in them, which would allow you to easily wash them out. If you ever had one that was starting to scratch a little bit or get noisy, you're just easily in there with some contact cleaner, which is nice. Also, notice that they're all plugged into the board. So if you have a pot that does start to get to the point where you just can't get the scratch out of it, all you have to do is unplug it and put a new pot in. I mean, of all the components in here, which are the ones you're going to replace the most? Input jack, you can just unplug it and get a new one. You don't have to take everything out and desolder from the main board. Just unplug it, get a new one. These pots, unplug it, get a new one. I love that. I think that extra attention to detail is pretty darn cool. Now, another funny thing I see in here are the oopses. And I'll show you what I mean. This is kind of funny because, and you may be familiar with electronics enough to just know that this happens. Theory and real life application don't always gel. Stuff happens. As good as theory is, when the rubber meets the road, sometimes we see that, oh, shoot. So this is pretty cool. This is I don't know if you can see this jumbled mess, but resistor up with a little extra capacitor in parallel, hooked to this thingamajig, and then it's attached to another resistor that's on end, and it's attached to this pot over here. All right, and now there's another one, resistor piggybacked on, or a capacitor piggybacked on top of a resistor, afterthought. Here's another one, capacitor on the back of a resistor. Over here, we've got two resistors, so we needed a little more, because we have two resistors in series there, where they realized, oh, shoot, well, we don't have enough there, so they upended them and tied them together instead of using one of the correct value, I suppose. But the work is fine, and what do I care as long as they figured it out and it works great. I mean, kudos to them for being willing to go back in and fine tune it, right? Instead of just pushing it out, knowing it could have been better. But there's another one right there, and there's another cap piggybacked on a resistor. Was it space saving? Perhaps. There's a bunch of them coupled together, which is just kind of interesting. But this is, I love that. That's just great. Let me see if I can get it in really good focus here. There you go. Oops. But I don't mind. I would rather have someone acknowledge that something could be better and take the time to fix it than push it out knowing that with a few simple changes could have been better. And they didn't. Now, the only pot I see in here is right there. And it may or may not be a gain control for the effects loop. I find the effects loop perfect. It's great. The angle effects loop is a little low in its gain, but I think it's because they have the attenuation on, because when you make changes to the attenuation in the Fireball, the effects loop values get a little better or less as well. But I'm not going to mess with that, of course. But it's a trimmer of some sort to fine-tune something in the effects loop. But how nice to know that all your effects loop stuff is right there. All your DI stuff is right there. I mean, pretty darn clean, right? Okay, so that's that side of it. And V1 is always next to the input. Remember that. You don't have to pull your chassis to see which is V1, V2, V3 according to the markings on the PCB board. It's V1 is just always going to be closest to where you plug the guitar in, and then next to that's V2. Do we have a tube buffered effects loop. I don't know if V3 goes here or V3 goes as another amp stage, preamp stage to here. There's no onboard reverb, so I know it's not dealing with that, but it very well could be dealing with this power stage, but not sure. All right, so nicely put together, and made in America. Thank you very much. All right, installment 3. Here's the top, or the back, but still the top. Power transformer, output transformer, EL84s, and then our valves. Here is valve number 1. Here's a signature of the guy who did us the favor of checking everything out. All right, so what I'd like to do is find a 12AY tube and put in there equivalent to a 6072. I don't know if there's an exact ECC equivalent to a 12AY. Remember, it goes, you think about the ecstasy you get from playing a guitar. So it's XTY in order of gain. 12AX is 100% gain. T is about 70%. And Y gets us down to about 40%. And then U is really low, not worth going to. But I find that the XTY, going to the Y is a nice place. T isn't always even enough to hear a difference with. So I went through these, and I did find that I've got a 12AY right there. And this is a Fender Groove tube. So this ought to be a very nice compatible tube to throw in here. When you remove a tube, you want to give it a little orbital twist as you pull it out. Don't have to worry about your fingertips. These don't get that hot. It's not like a filament or a bulb in an overhead projector. And then when you do this, you rotate the new one, give it a little orbital action, make sure it goes all the way down, and it's nice and snug. All right, and then we'll go in here, and that's made in Russia. Made in Russia. And we'll plug it back in and see if you can hear any difference. We'll leave all the settings the same, of course. There you go. Amplification, Los Angeles. Made in America. I actually did listen to the playback on the video, and pleasantly surprised with you can hear a difference in the YouTube video, which is cool. And I noticed a difference in the room, and I like what happened. I appreciate it. I find it a little more fun to play because you can always add gain. You can always push the gain up to that compressed level, but it's really hard to pull it back because it's built into the nature of the circuit. When it's designed that way, it's hard to pull it out without having the gain so far down that you lose, I don't know, the tonal characteristic of the tone that you're kind of looking for. If that makes sense, great. If not, ask me a question about it. I'll try to explain it further. But you can always add. And what I found was I appreciate the lesser gain in both channels. And it's just, if I want to get back to that more overdriven, more compressed tone, all I have to do is hit the flux drive or even the OCD, and it gets right back to where this is as it was with the stock tube. So it's real easy to increase gain. It's harder to pull gain out of a circuit without having levels so low that you're not properly driving the tubes. Okay? And then I made a mistake on the gain order of tubes, the X, T, and Y. It's X is 100, T is more like 90%. There's not very much of a change. The 5701, I think is that the number is correct, is another nice tube to try that's one notch down. It's about 80%. And then the Y is a 70% gain. And when you get to the U, that's a 40% drop in gain, which is often too much. It's too drastic, not good. But I am a big fan of the Y versions, and the 57 tube is also one I really appreciate. But just going from an X to a T there's very little adjustment to the gain, and I don't think you're even going to hear it. All right, so I really suggest getting in the back of this thing and try it. See if you don't really like the, well, I'm not going to say improve because tonal's always, subjective, but see if you don't really like what happens to the amp when you lower that first one. Valve 1, 12AY 2. All right. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you on the flip side.